Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Rollins Museum of Art. There's some seats available up at the front, so if you're just getting into the gallery, you're welcome to join us up here. I'm Dr. Carbonell, curator here at the Rollins Museum of Art, and I'm delighted to welcome you to tonight's event. Please note that this event is being live streamed, and the recording will be available on the museum's YouTube channel in a few days for later viewing and sharing with your friends who couldn't make it. Before I introduce our guest speaker, please make sure you silence your cell phone. And if you have a minute or two after the presentation, we welcome your feedback on the comment cards provided on each seat. I want to thank all of you as well as our members and the Thomas P. Johnson Distinguished Visiting Scholars and Artists Program for making this event possible tonight, which is in conjunction, of course, with the exhibition Pressing Issues, Printmaking as Social Justice in 1930s United States. The lecture will be followed by a Q&A session. I'm excited to introduce our speaker tonight, Kathryn Koca Polite. Katie is Assistant Curator and Publication Specialist at the Curator Art Museum at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, my alma mater. She started working at CAMP while completing her MA in art history from the University of Illinois and has worked in various capacities at the museum since 2006. Her curated collection-based exhibitions primarily center on 20th century works in the United States, including modernist strategies, highlights of the WPA in 2021, Between the Buildings, Art from Chicago, 1930s to 1980s in 2018, Post-war printmaking in the United States, 1945 to 1955 in 2017, and Art as Provocation in 2014. Her exhibition, Pattern and Process, currently up at CAM until the end of December, examines how artists have utilized pattern to make sense of the world. Her projects have been supported by the IFPDA Foundation, International Fine Print Dealers Association, the Wyeth Foundation for American Art, and the Illinois Art Council. And she's a member of the Print Council of America. Katie also manages CAM's publication program, working with fellow CAM curators to produce exhibition brochures and catalogs such as Maureen Warren's Paper Knives, Paper Crowns, Political Prints in the Dutch Republic in 2022, and Amy Powell's catalog, A Question of Emphasis, Louise Fishman drawing, recognized by the Midwest Art History Society as an outstanding catalog in 2021. Katie started working on Pressing Issues in the gallery next door in 2020 at a time of great social and political discussion in the US. And we are thrilled to have it on view here, as many of the themes it addresses are timely and relevant today. Please help me welcome Kathryn Koca Polite.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. Please let me know if I am not speaking loud enough. If I start to go down, just like raise your head or your hand and let me know. But thank you, Dr. Carbonell, and everyone here at Rollins for inviting me and for taking the exhibition. Due to the COVID-19 pandemic, the exhibition was only on view at Curator Art Museum for about 6 weeks, which is a relatively short amount of time for exhibitions to be up. So it's been such a treat to actually see it installed here. Everyone here at Rollins has been so lovely. So thank you so much to David and to Laura and to everyone else. So thank you. So I'm not sure if you've had a chance to walk through the exhibition yet. But to briefly explain, Pressing Issues, Printmaking as Social Justice in 1930s United States, which is quite a long title. It brings together prints by artists who, through their work, produced critical commentaries on the social injustices plaguing the country during the Great Depression. Divided into 4 sections, fighting for workers' rights, women at work, denouncing fascism, and condemning racial terror, the exhibition foregrounds how artists demanded real societal and legislative change during this period, and considers how far the country has progressed in terms of these injustices and how much work still needs to happen. Aesthetically speaking, the show presents a range of styles: expressionism, surrealism, cubism, and the American scene, which is a really generic term that really covers social realism and American regionalism that emerged in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. And these styles are all used to varying degrees, but I believe that the artist's commentaries are still very much accessible through their imagery. For this talk, I'll briefly discuss my curatorial vision for the show, provide historical context for the prints, particularly focusing on the WPA, and then really dive into the exhibition's themes and discuss specific works of art. So here we go. Oh, it's not on. I don't think it's on, sorry. My apologies. So I start with this print by Alan Freelon because the initial impetus for organizing this exhibition was the 2020 presidential election. In campaign headquarters, which you see here, Freelon places a smiling, sycophantic politician wringing his hands behind a microphone, speaking to a group of men. The crowd appears to have diverse economic and racial backgrounds, and several downtrodden individuals, clothed in their work attire, convey a sense of uneasiness and despair. They all seem to be unconvinced by the politician's words, which at this point, I feel like we've all experienced similar skepticism through various media or at political events. Not to make light of our political climate, but it feels like so much has occurred in the last 5 years, seemingly something new every day, that while planning this exhibition, I wanted to draw connections to the 2020 election and to social justice themes. And in using works as a backdrop and as a jumping off point for conversations around social justice, I envision the galleries as a civic space where university and community groups could meet and discuss these ongoing injustices. However, the COVID-19 pandemic happened, and that wasn't going to work. As I scoured CAM's 20th century collection, I became increasingly enthralled with the prints produced during the Depression, specifically those created under the auspice of the Works Progress Administration's Federal Art Project. Granite Art Museum holds a vast WPA collection, which includes 35 paintings, about a dozen or so sculptures, and around 450 prints that the government allocated to the university in 1943 after the WPA dissolved. There are certainly works that conveyed a sense of national pride and nostalgia, while others portrayed the hardships and the anxieties brought on by the Depression. But really what I was seeking after were works that railed against injustices caused by society, capitalism, and the government, just without an overly political tone. There have been insightful exhibitions that explore leftist political works from the 1930s. An exhibition that comes to mind is the 2014 exhibition, The Left Front, Radical Art in the Red Decade, which was organized and hosted at the Block Museum of Art at Northwestern University. It's a great project. But for my project, I found that the visual imagery and messages that the everyday person could recognize and empathize with primarily informed my choices. Printmaking also seemed an obvious choice due to its democratic medium. One that was accessible in terms of reproducibility, content, and availability. And it's been used repeatedly throughout the years by artists with social and political intentions. To briefly place the prints in their historical context, the stock market crash of 1929 brought about the Great Depression, the worst economic downturn in the history of the United States. Industrial production and consumer spending slowed, employment opportunities dwindled, banks failed, financial investments vanished, and breadlines surged, which you see here outside of the Soup Kitchen in Chicago. By early 1933, nearly 12 million people were unemployed in the United States. Within the first 100 days of taking office in 1933, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt enacted the New Deal, a series of programs, public work projects, regulations, and financial assistance that aimed to bring economic stability through relief, reform, and recovery. At the urging of his friend George Biddle, who was an artist, Roosevelt established the Federal Art Project 1, an arm of the New Deal's Work Progress Administration, so the WPA, which had provided jobs to visual artists, musicians, actors, and writers. The program employed 8.5 million people between 1935 and 1943. And during the first year of the FAP in 1935, nearly 10,000 artists received wages. That is amazing. The government's investment in the arts during this time is unprecedented in US history, a moment where art was considered central to economic recovery. On the left here, you see an infographic that breaks down the percentages of who all was actually employed in the FAP. And you can see on there that the largest is fine art, and then practical, education, and miscellaneous. So arts education and outreach grew throughout the nation during this time, with over 100 community art centers being established. The Harlem Community Art Center was perhaps the most well-known of these centers. And the Southside Community Art Center in Chicago is probably the longest running. It is still operable and still working with local artists. But it was at these centers where children and adults alike were encouraged to engage with various art programs, which was fantastic. And so on the right here, you see a picture of a class of the Harlem Community Art Center. While artists in the mural and easel divisions of the WPA FAP often produced social realist works that addressed anxieties of everyday life, perhaps the most formidable critiques of the government and society came from the graphic arts division. The graphic workshops employed many women artists, as well as immigrant artists and African-American printmakers, although the program was far from being equitable in terms of opportunities for women and people of color. Printmakers collaborated in workshops where they were provided supplies and a press, which was incredibly difficult to come by for artists without the government-funded program. The largest of the graphic arts division was located in New York, and many of the prints and pressing issues came from that division. Not all of them, but a good majority of them are. So dedicated to the democratization of art, many artists chose lithography, a printmaking technique from the commercial world that had low production cost, potential for the largest editions, and was not considered too highbrow or academic for a mass audience. Accessibility was essential, not only in terms of reproducibility and content, but also availability. Prints were exhibited in WPA and FAP exhibitions that toured the country. They were also hung in public facilities, government buildings, schools, libraries, and hospitals, on display for all to see. All public spaces, all free. Between 1935 and 1943, the printmakers in the graphic arts division printed around 240,000 impressions from 11,000 different compositions. So the government had to figure out what to do with 240,000 prints. And I should note here that after the WPA was shut down, and after the government made their allocations to universities, museums, and libraries worldwide, many prints were lost, destroyed, or sold by the pound from the government. So the government would put together big packages and sell it to people by the pound. You could even get them out of dumpsters, which is just sad. The University of Illinois was a recipient of these allocations in 1943, and again, most of the prints that are in there are a few exceptions, but that they are from that allocation in 1943. So, we are going to jump into some themes. One of the most prevalent themes in art during the Great Depression was labor, whether it was politicized through the imagery of the heroic male worker or expressed in sentimental terms, focused on the rewarding value of manual labor. However, artists such as Ida Abelman, Leroy Flint, Boris Gurelick, and Harry Gottlieb, as well as many others, sought to raise awareness of the harsh and exploitative labor conditions through their prints, often visiting coal mines and factories to document these circumstances if they could not draw from their own experiences of labor as laborers. Michael Gallagher, whose lithograph on the left, my accident we see here, heard about working conditions in the anthracite mines in Scranton, Pennsylvania, directly from his family members. So his father and his brothers all worked in the mines. In this print, an idealized muscular worker is being carried out of a mine due to an accident, intimating that the harsh realities of mining work affects everyone, and it does not discriminate. Mining prints, as well as works that depicted and commented critically on child labor, the economic hardships of those barely scraping by, and inadequate working conditions, were created by artists with the intention to effect real legislative change. Those are highlighted in the section, Fighting for Workers' Rights. And here you see I included a documentary photograph of coal mines a little later than that of Gallagher, but it gives you an idea of how close Gallagher really was to what it was actually like, which also leads me to believe that maybe he did actually gain access to the mines. I'm not sure. One instance of artists seeing the working conditions firsthand is when Harry Gottlieb and Elizabeth Olds, Elizabeth Olds is sadly not included in the exhibition, but Harry Gottlieb is, and they became interested in mining subjects, perhaps after watching an October 1935 newsreel, March of Time, that highlighted striking coal miners in Pennsylvania. When plant owners were unwilling to negotiate new union contracts, the workers decided to open a bootleg operation and sell coal at lower prices. They needed to work. Not only were bootleg operations legal, but they were even more unsafe than company-owned coal mines. So in 1936, Gottlieb and Olds drove to Pennsylvania to see this for themselves, but they weren't trusted by the miners until the artists joined their union in the other town. So Gottlieb and Olds were given permission, so Gottlieb and Olds became union members, and they went back to the miners, and they finally gave them permission to make sketches of the mines. I'm not sure how far into, I don't know that Harry was able to gain access into the mine. I know that Elizabeth would not have been able to, women were not allowed in the mines. But anyway, so bootleg coal mining comes from that experience. He sketched this and then ultimately made a print. I think he might have made a few others, but I'm not entirely sure. Perhaps one of the most complex prints in the exhibition is Ida Edelman's lithograph, My Father Reminisces, from 1937. Combining social realist themes with influences from European modernist styles, particularly constructivism and surrealism. Edelman's prints from the 1930s often explore the role of technology and its negative effects on human life and workers. When she was younger, Edelman spent a few years working in a doll factory, which granted her intimate knowledge of the treatment of young assembly workers. And in this print, she utilizes her and her father's factory experiences to critique gender and labor exploitation. By using montage, she presents the lives of garment workers in a multi-layered historical narrative, beginning with the arrival of immigrants by boat on the left. So we're going to look at some details. Family members embrace, perhaps reuniting after a period of absence, while a man sits with his head in his hands, most likely tired from his travels. Several figures appear joyous and hopeful for a prosperous future in the United States, particularly the man holding a basket with large coins that dance around his head. Two young girls appear simultaneously curious and apprehensive as they stare upon the sewing machine, perhaps looking to their future in the sewing mills. The woman with a long braid in her hair under her hat stands tall in front of the group, with her arms wide open, gesturing a hope and happiness upon her arrival in this new country. As we continue the narrative, Abelman criticizes the poor working conditions in sweatshops, which we can see here through the enlarged sewing machine in the foreground. With piece workers who are being crushed underneath. So you can kind of barely see the outlines in black there. The industry shows no mercy for its workers as they toil at their machines. The figure hunched over in the front stands on what looks to be a treadle from a foot-powered sewing machine with bare feet, enlarged presumably from the intense and constant strain from the factory work. A ghostly statue of liberty appears in the center, symbolizing the complexity of the American dream and critically questioning how realistic that dream can be and if it's even attainable. But throughout, women are at the forefront of this history. She continues the narrative with the formation of the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, which was established in 1900, and the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire of 1911, one of the deadliest industrial disasters in US history, when 146 people were killed because of inadequate working conditions where doors and windows were barred, so they weren't able to escape. We see pickets with slogans in the background that state wages in cash, suffrage for women, abolish child labor, and WPA must go on. To end the Prince narrative, Abelman charges wealthy fat cat industrialists with complicity in perpetuating unsafe working conditions. A hand reaches out behind a wall or a door that you can see there, straining for help, while three heads in white collars float in the bottom right corner, smoking their cigars and appearing unaffected and unconcerned by the lives of the workers. As the title suggests, this print references the dreams and struggles of her father and his immigration to the US. Abelman recalled her father as saying, "No history will ever be able to fully describe how much we have suffered. It is wonderful to realize that workers have brought about so many advantageous changes. There is still so much for us to do." So as referenced in My Father Reminisces, strikes and protests were widespread throughout the early 20th century and certainly in the 1930s. Hermann Volz, a Swiss-born artist who immigrated to the US in 1933, ultimately moving to the Bay Area in San Francisco, was an artist who produced scathing critiques of labor conditions and inequities through modernist visual strategies. And in his 1937 lithograph, sorry about that. In his 1937 lithograph Scab, moves into the arena of the absurd for his critique of workers who were desperate enough to cross the picket line. Evocative of Salvador Dali's surrealist figures and Giorgio de Chirico's desolate landscapes, Volz dehumanizes the figure by depicting the scab, which was a derogatory term to describe a strike breaker. He depicts the scab as a deformed body with a hooked torso and two legs pointing in opposite directions, seemingly unable to move. As part of the National Labor Relations Act, also known as the Wagner Act of 1935, workers were given the right to organize unions and to collectively bargain with their employers. However, there are often conflicts between employers and unions, as we still see today. And scabs and strike breakers made themselves available to take the place of workers on strike, breaking not only the solidarity of union workers, but the dignity of their work as well. The scab stands in a bleak, nondescript, and severely rendered industrial environment. A pulley lies on the ground with the rope severed on both ends, alluding to a broken system that is amplified by those who are uninterested in unionizing and opt to work for less. Volz's absurd and dehumanizing depiction of the strikebreaker reinforces his critique of those who chose to undermine the union collective by making the pulley inoperable, so the hooked torso cannot function without the hook on the pulley, and making the building inaccessible. There are no doors for entrance or exit. And so there are also prints, including this lithograph by Thomas Hart Benton, that highlighted the violence that ensued during strikes and protests. Although this print was not produced under the WPA, and it's not in this installation here, we had it at CAM and it was unable to travel. But it's such a significant print and one of Benton's earliest that I really wanted to show it here. So Mine Strike depicts a common situation in the late 1920s and 30s where workers bravely fight for safer working conditions, higher wages, and other inequities. So 4 coal miners appear off-center, bathed in bright light, 2 with mouths open, holding an empty sign, while 1 is sprawled on the ground, either injured or dead. 2 armed militiamen that are poised to fight are cast in shadows. Faceless, 1 aims a gun at the strikers, while the others stand ready in the foreground. While Benton's print evokes sympathy with the miners, portraying them heroically, he also critiques those workers who chose not to strike. As a silhouetted worker cowardly avoids the confrontational scene by quietly escaping in the very, very far background to your right there. You can kind of see that silhouette. Although the section Women at Work still pertains to issues of labor, I wanted to highlight prints that portray the significance of women as active agents of labor. While depictions of the male laborer abound in paintings, murals, prints, and illustrations from the 1930s, representations of women in the workforce are particularly absent in prints, reflecting the gender discrimination at play during this tumultuous era. Although more than 10 million women factored into the US labor force in the 1930s, they faced hostility and challenging obstacles, particularly the idea that women were stealing jobs from eligible male workers. Before they became a major force in the working economy in the 1940s, employed largely as part of the war effort, women were confined to a small number of gendered positions. So that included teachers, nurses, and manufacturing jobs. So whether that was the sewing mills, textiles, garment mills. Positions that those in power deemed appropriate for, in their view, unskilled women. Sewing rooms were the largest component of the WPA program for women, in which old clothing was repaired and remodeled, and new garments were made from surplus fabrics for distribution to families on relief. So actually really important work. And in 1936, 56% of all women employed by the WPA worked in sewing rooms. And so I showed you a print that was included at CAM, couldn't travel, along with one of the sewing rooms from Fort Wayne, Indiana in 1930, just to kind of give you visuals. Many women who worked on WPA projects were particularly drawn to depicting the nature of these low-paying jobs and the working conditions that they were compelled to endure. Prints that documented and gave a voice to women workers were often produced by women artists. These include Minetta Good, Reba Helfand, Kyra Markham, and Charlotte Rothstein. Before gaining employment through the WPA, Reba Helfand experienced factory conditions firsthand for a brief period in New York, working at a textile factory while studying art. Her works during the Depression often condemned the state of labor, as we can see here in Custom Made from 1938. Helfand depicts a seamstress slumped over a foot-powered sewing machine, working late into the night on garments that she brought home to earn extra, albeit meager, wages after a long day laboring in the sewing rooms. Hair pulled back, the figure appears completely defeated and tired, almost resting her head on the sewing machine as her foot gently works the treadle below. Helfand evokes a sense of anguish through the compressed space, the angular treatment of the figure's body, and the slightly distorted perspective. With her face in the shadow, the woman is emblematic of the exhausted woman worker. A rack of finished garments is illuminated in the background, while a dress form stands tall behind the woman, referencing the endless hours of tedious labor and fatigue, as well as the grim determination of women who accepted employment that often paid very little. Through strikes, sit-ins, and other forms of protests, the 1930s saw some significant improvements to labor conditions, including the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938, which established minimum wage, overtime pay over 40 hours of work a week, and restrictions on child employment. Custom made was produced that same year. And while employed on the WPA, Helfand was first assigned to the Harlem Community Arts Center, where she taught lithography alongside such artists as Jacob Lawrence and Romare Bearden, and mentored young printmakers, including Robert Blackburn. She later worked with Jacob Kanan and Louis Lozowick in the Graphic Arts Division, producing lithographs, etchings, woodcuts, and screen prints. And I also wanted to highlight a relatively unknown artist who also places women workers front and center. Charlotte Rothstein, an artist born in Poland who immigrated to the US in 1923, was concerned with the working conditions in Chicago, particularly the meat packing industry. But in this print, Sleeve Pressers from 1939, she highlights laundresses at work pressing sleeves. African Americans entered the garment industry after World War I, as many moved their homes from southern farms to northern cities as part of the Great Migration. By 1930, approximately 32,000 African Americans were employed in the clothing industries, which had an overall workforce of more than 400,000. As in other areas of work, they were often restricted to the poorer paying positions, though a number found work as pressers, which was one of the better paid garment jobs. In this print, Rothstein incorporates her version of expressionism, creating a frenzied energy around the workers, as dark undulating lines weave throughout the composition, further enhanced by the detailed wood grain in the planks of the floorboards and a severe perspective. Outside of the domestic sphere, prints depicting African American women as active laborers are rare. And the image to the right, Artist at Work, is by Minetta Good. And I just really love this print because it celebrates the idea of artists as viable workers during the Depression, thanks to the efforts of the New Deal programs. Good's self-portrait in her Greenwich Village apartment studio shows her engaged in valuable creative work. She portrays her own contributions while also standing in for other women artists at the time. So the FAP was actually 40% were women artists, which not equal, but we're getting there. Gotta be more. But anyway. The next exhibition section is titled Denouncing Fascism. In addition to the pictorial language of class conflict and working conditions, artists in the 1930s condemned discrimination and violent suppression incited by the rise of fascist ideologies occurring in Europe, specifically Spain, Italy, and Germany. After World War I, the United States positioned itself as non-interventionist, condemning the actions and ideologies of those authoritarian dictators while remaining isolationist. Leftist artists were among those concerned with the human suffering caused by these fascist uprisings. So the rise of Nazi Germany was in 1933, the Italian invasion of Ethiopia in 1935, and the Spanish Civil War from 1936 to 1939. And in response, these artists established the American Artists Congress in 1936 as part of the Popular Front of the Communist Party. But their intention was really to unite artists in helping to combat war and the spread of fascism. Among other things, the AAC was responsible, I'm pretty sure, for bringing Picasso's painting Guernica to New York, which also helped draw attention to the rising fascism in Europe in a very, very profound way. A number of leftist artists, as well as the members of the AAC, produced illustrations for journals and magazines, paintings and prints that vehemently denounced such violent acts, often utilizing modernist visual strategies to provoke an emotional response for the viewer, or from the viewer. William Gropper, who we see here, Sweatshop is his lithograph on the left. Although his work is included in a different exhibition section, I still wanted to draw your attention to him here because he often contributed to these publications, including The Liberator and Masses and other publications, in addition to his work for the WPA. However, not all artists in the WPA joined the AAC or other politically minded affiliations, yet they still decried the injustices perpetuated by fascism in their prints, which you can see next door. Artists often used surrealist strategies to emphasize the horror, suffering, and destruction brought on by wartime conflict, providing a window into someone's emotional reality through psychologically charged images. Several prints in this section focus on the destruction caused by the Spanish Civil War, including this work by Boris Gorelick. Born in Russia and raised in the US, Gorelick was a politically active artist who helped actually form the Artists Union, which agitated for government relief for professional artists during the Depression and served as its president for several years. Along with other leftist artists, Gorelick sympathized with the left-leaning Republican government officials who were fighting against the fascist nationalists in Spain, who were under the direction of General Francisco Franco. Here, bombing, most likely referencing the bombing of Barcelona. And the reason why I say that is because for some reason, Gorelick titled this as bombing, but other impressions, he titled it Bombing Barcelona. So that leads me to believe that he's talking about the Spanish Civil War. So in this, he depicts fragmented and distorted figures whirling amidst a sea of destruction. In the upper left corner, a bomb looms above a teary eye, and very much in the style of Dali. While toward the right, a face with sunken eyes and nostrils appears next to a silhouette of a hand in a fiery blaze. A figure dramatically lunges toward a woman, presumably holding a child, lost within this turmoil. In the far background, Gorelick depicts an obliterated landscape. Shells of buildings stand amidst holes in the ground from numerous bombings. A sense of urgency and trauma is heightened further through manière noire, which was a subtractive printmaking technique in which an image is made by scraping away the ink on a black flat, leaving the white areas that you see here as the image. There are also pointed critiques by Florence Kent, Chet Moore, and Joseph Lebois as they depict the plight of Jewish immigrants and refugees fleeing Germany, fearful of the horrific conditions of rising fascism and the discrimination they encountered during a period of national isolationism. Born to Eastern European Jewish immigrants, Lebois was a social activist who attended protests and rallies. In this print, Refugees from 1936, Lebois creates a harrowing scene of refugees struggling to find their way with no help or guidance. Centrally located in the print, two women and a child are bent over, carrying their possessions in bags while traversing a treacherous and lifeless terrain of dying trees, shells of buildings, and a ferocious wind. These forces work against the refugees, as the roots of the felled tree in the foreground almost entrap the women with their sharp tendrils, reinforcing the feeling of being estranged from their homeland and disenfranchised in their new country. After World War I, the United States positioned itself as non-interventionist, as I said before, and it was actually rather anti-immigration under President Herbert Hoover, who established exclusionary measures during the first years of the Depression, where he was denying visas and increasing deportations. Although President Roosevelt did enact policies that halted some of the Hoover administration's most divisive practices, immigration continued to plummet while deportations rose. And although Roosevelt condemned the actions and ideologies of those authoritarian dictators, the US did not engage in military conflict until the bombing of Pearl Harbor, which ushered the country's entry into World War II. Distressed about discriminatory acts toward immigrants and refugees, LeBois, who changed his name from Leibowitz, perhaps due to the mounting anti-Semitism in the US, condemns these injustices in this print, conveying the psychological anguish and agony and the continual hardships experienced by refugees seeking exile, fearful for their lives. There are distinct resonances with the discriminatory and inhumane practices pertaining to immigrants and refugees today, enabled and promoted by the last administration. And before I get into the last section, I just wanted to mention that there may be some difficult imagery that we'll see here. And so if you need to take some time and step away, I understand that, but I'm going to provide some historical and visual context to more fully understand these images. And finally, I want to discuss the last section, condemning racial terror. While artists were given a fair amount of artistic freedom with imagery in the print's content in the WPA, approval from the division head was necessary before print was produced. This may explain why many artists chose not to depict the injustices and graphic violence inflicted upon African Americans. Although this thematic section in the exhibition is small, the works are difficult. Yet powerful images that assert the complicity of white Americans in the racial terror that targeted African Americans in the 1930s. Mobs in the Ku Klux Klan used lynching as a powerful, symbolic, and physical act to instill fear within the African American community. And they really used it to attempt to enforce white supremacy and social segregation. State officials and local law enforcement did little to prevent these tragic events, rarely attempting to arrest the responsible parties to seek justice for the victims of lynching and their families. And really, they also helped aid and abet by just not doing anything and allowing them to run rampant. But anyway, for Cam's installation, I included two prints borrowed from the University of Michigan's Michigan Museum of Art that clearly condemns white supremacy in this heinous history. And unfortunately, again, we're not able to travel, so they're not here. One of them is this work by Chet Lamore, Ku Kluxers, which graphically, very graphically, denounces the Ku Klux Klan. Through its simple yet aggressive image of three hooded figures, Ku Kluxers condemns the horror of lynching. In the aftermath of violence, the artist emphasizes the danger these hostile individuals propagated. Red markings stain their gowns, while two figures stare out of their hoods with blood-red eyes. This marks them as cowards, hiding their identity behind their hoods and taking cover in the widespread power of the hate group. And the other work that was included in Cam's exhibition was John Stewart Curry's Manhunt, which you see here on the left. And that focuses on the moral depravity of white mobs, many of which often search for their lynching victims under the cover of night. Curry conveys this posse's fanaticism as they hunt their prey with a feverish sense of mission. This is evoked through the bloodhound lunging forward with its mouth open, the rearing horse, the forward movement of the figures, and the various guns pointed in all directions, ready to shoot at any moment. Although photographs exist that capture the abhorrent communal spectacle of lynchings, Curry and other artists who focused on these unseen moments helped implicate white militia, members of police, and other community members in deadly violence perpetrated against Black people. He also produced The Fugitive in 1935, which you see here on the right, that shows almost the exact same scene in the background, amidst all of the leaves in the background. So it's in the background, but from the perspective of the fugitive, who is standing rather rigid mimicking the trunk and branches of the tree as he looks to the sky. The leaves almost look like flames, heightening the tension. And overall, the image poignantly conveys his emotional stress of fear and hope in this moment of life and death. So Curry submitted The Fugitive along with 2 other paintings. He actually did an oil painting of Manhunt, and that was also included in an exhibition that was organized by the NAACP and the College Art Association, which was titled An Art Commentary on Anti-Lynching, which is one of 2 anti-lynching exhibitions organized in 1935 that advocated for legislative policy to declare lynching a federal crime. And this was specifically organized to help push the Costigan-Wagner Act of 1934 through Congress. 38 artists submitted work to this exhibition, explicit imagery and depictions that were shocking reminders of the reality of life for African Americans in the Deep South. The exhibition didn't work in terms of legislative progress, but it showed a collective attempt by artists and cultural organizations to advocate for social justice. It would take many, many, many decades before anti-lynching would become a federal hate crime. In March of 2022, the Emmett Till Anti-Lynching Act was signed into law by President Biden. Far too late. Another artist who submitted prints to the NAACP's exhibition was Hale Woodruff. Born in Illinois and raised in Nashville, Tennessee, Woodruff created paintings, murals, some in the WPA, and prints that explored African-American life and history through an expressive figurative style in the 1930s and 40s before turning completely to abstraction. While teaching at Atlanta University, Woodruff produced a series of linoleum prints that included a range of imagery that depicted the celebration and joy of Black life, resilience amidst oppression, and the condemnation of white supremacy. In these 2 prints, Woodruff depicts graphic scenes of figures before and after lynching. The explicit imagery in Gadap targets the white terror perpetuated in the segregated South by white mobs and militia, addressing the brutal lynchings inflicted upon African Americans. Surrounded by threatening spectators, the central figure stands upright and fully clothed, almost in a Christ-like pose, appealing to the morality of the viewer. He clearly depicts each spectator also giving a face to that violent mob and placing the blame firmly on their shoulders. As stated by the American scholar Helen Langa, quote, "Without denying the terrible impact of lynching violence, Hale Woodruff insisted on the power of Black manhood to resist rather than emphasize Black powerlessness and defeat," end quote. And by portraying a victim left on the steps of a church in By Parties Unknown, which you see on the right, by parties unknown was actually a phrase often used by local law enforcement to avoid identifying lynchers. So again, giving them a clean slate and letting them go free. Woodruff condemns the hypocrisy of Southern whites who, while even committing such violent acts, consider themselves good Christians. So while I end my talk on a rather dark note, I do hope you realize that there are numerous connections between the present day and the 1930s and that they're evident, given the escalating social and economic upheaval in the United States in the last decade. Our current political climate, intensified and exacerbated by the global pandemic, is fueling similar sorts of isolationism and nationalism, a rise of fascist ideologies, and a resurgence of brutal anti-Black violence. However, the 1930s also brought about tangible change in the labor force, including overtime pay, the ability to unionize and collectively bargain, and restrictions on child labor, just to name a few. So these are all due to those artists who advocated and fought hard for social justice. And I believe these artists fall into that category of activism. often overlooked, these prints from the 1930s, particularly by the artists working in the WPA, provide a visceral and a much needed reminder of how visual artists can call attention to and combat oppression in all its forms. Thank you for listening. So I'm open to questions if anyone has any.
Did you, when curating this, did you have to go to several collections, or you familiar with all the pieces that are here?
So all of the pieces that are in the exhibition are from Curator Art Museum's collection. So I was able to look at them in person where I work. Yeah.
So you said there were several exhibits at the NAACP one. Are there any? There was a high degree of curation in the farm photographs of the farm bureau.
Sure.
In here, was there any kind of suppression of information like the Ku Klux Klanners and that, or did they have exhibits? What kind of exhibits were during the WPA during that time?
So that's a great question, and I think that there's still a lot of research that needs to be done about that. I don't know exactly what kind of content was toured in those exhibitions. I'm sure that I shouldn't say this, but I'm going to assume that not a lot of the works from Pressing Issues were included in that. Those might have been more exalting and bolstering the public. They might have been more inspiring or trying to be inspiring, particularly through the Depression. But I'm not sure. So the NAACP and the CAA's exhibition, there was also another exhibition that was done at the same time. Those were specifically to push legislation. And so those were curated with a very particular objective in mind. Whereas the other ones, I think the WPA exhibitions are just to get the word out and showcase the work of these artists. So
But there was no, I could do what I want. I'm an artist. I have restrictions when I put things out like this. Or?
So I can't speak for the mural and easel division, which was the painting division. I believe murals, they had a very particular set of restrictions. They had several layers of approval that you had to go through. But the graphic arts division, I don't think it was the same. Because I don't think that some of those prints would have been able to be, would have seen the light of day, But yeah, the printmakers really had a lot of freedom in the content and in the style that they created in. But because there were so many prints made and so many impressions, I'm not sure how many were actually seen. And that's just because the government, I don't believe, had a really great inventory program. And I don't know where that ephemera actually exists. So like if there were exhibition brochures, I don't know where they are, if they still exist. So for the 1935 NAACP exhibition, I think one of the only reasons why we know we have a clear idea of who was even involved was because Hale Woodruff kept brochures and he put them in his papers, which I think are in Atlanta. So yeah, it's just a matter of finding those pieces and putting that puzzle together. So I'm sorry, I don't have a great answer for you, but yeah. Yes.
For those pictures, we're seeing who benefited, because paint art, we usually paint art for the benefit of the viewer. So who were the viewers?
That's a great question. According to the people in charge of the Federal Art Project, the viewer would have been anyone. And I should say that not all of the prints that I showed were created under the WPA. So the Woodruffs were not WPA. Those were his own prints that he created, particularly for that 1935 exhibition. There were a few others that might not have been the WPA, but everything else in the mind of the government and whoever was in charge, that would have been for the everyday person, something that they could empathize with, that they could learn from, that they could enjoy. But of course, because you have such a range of artists, I mean, we're talking thousands of artists, they all have their own point of view and their own perspective and their own style. So that was kind of the beauty part though of the WPA, because you had that latitude, you had that freedom to basically do whatever you want. Now, again, I don't know exactly, other than knowing that these were placed in public buildings, I don't know exactly what was shown. So I also don't know how they would have interacted with them and what they would have thought of it, their feedback. So I'm not sure, other than it was supposed to be the everyday person. Does that kind of answer it a little bit?
Yeah, back in New York, I seen some WPA murals.
Yes.
Where the average man will take a look at some in the post office. They got away with
Yes.
that already. So
Yeah.
they still have it back then, but some of them have been erased.
Yes. Well, I think some of the, and again, the murals are not, I need to do more research on the murals. And a little bit of a tangent, but the post office in my hometown, I didn't even know that the post office had a WPA mural until I got much older. I didn't make that connection. But anyway, I think that some of the murals have been covered up. I don't know permanently. I don't know what the repercussions of that would even be, but technically, they all belong to the government, because it was the government who paid the artists to, it was basically the government commissioning artists to do work. So I'm not sure how many, I'm assuming that a lot of the murals still exist, but I don't know who keeps that inventory other than the government, and I would need to do more digging around for that. Does that, okay. Anyone else? Yeah.
Well, on one of the first slides, it's WPA, like 49% fine artists, and then underneath that is a practical art. Would that be ceramics or?
That's a really great question. Let me see if I can catch it. Sorry. The question. It's a lot of slides. Oops.
Yeah, practical arts. I just wondered what that meant.
So I can read it from here.
Oh.
So it was ceramics, arts and crafts, the index of design, which was a major, I think they went all around and inventoried different types of design. Photography, which the FSA probably would have fallen under. Stage set and diorama. And I can't tell if it says pottery and applied arts. So that was definitely, there was a division between fine art and craft that we still kind of see today. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, no problem. Yes.
Can you speak a little bit about the afterlife of when the WPA was dissolved, 1940, early 40s?
43.
So like in the years during and after the war and during the McCarthy era, given that a lot of these artists were very openly leftist and activists, and this imagery is so critical, were these images kind of relegated to storages, and was it later that scholars like
I think it was
interested in that?
much later. I think it was much later, and I feel like you had so the trajectory of what you're taught in art history courses typically, the canon is like you have European modernism moves into the US, and then bam, you have abstract expressionism, and that is the new American form. And they don't really talk about the WPA. I think they're starting to more now, but I don't think it was really until like the last couple of decades that people really see the value of the works that were created under the WPA. Now, I feel like there's been scholars for quite a while, but there is a really great book by Helen Lange called Radical Prints, who kind of like, if you take the exhibition and expand it dramatically, like she talks about the political aspects, she talks about new masses and the leftist leaning groups, but then she also talks about just the other prints of the 1930s, but that was published maybe 15, 20 years ago, if I'm remembering correctly. So I don't really know. I think that in the 1950s and 60s, it was really about perpetuating like this American style, which at that time was abstract expressionism, and then you move into minimalism and conceptual, like it just didn't, I don't think people really gave it much importance. So, but yeah.
Along that line, how was this product, I'll call it, distributed once it was produced? Were they sold? Were they just given out like flyers on the street corner?
No, they weren't
So
given out.
how widespread was the distribution of the imagery?
Mm-hmm.
Could this have dampened the interest of people if it was just put in a storeroom?
Right. Well, I mean, the whole idea is, I think that a lot of people thought that this was lowbrow. I mean, if it was for everyone, then what is the artistic value to that? I mean, to certain people, that's just where I'm going with that. Like I said, it was supposed to go out to public buildings for everyone to look. They weren't sold, or they weren't handed out. From the research that I've read, it says that they were sold, but I don't know how, if that was during exhibitions and they had a handful of prints that you could buy for a very small amount of money. We're not talking about the Associated American Artists or any other subscription type print club that emerged in the 1930s to really put art in people's homes. I don't think the WPA was that. It was much more of a civic-minded program that was to benefit the everyday person, but in public spaces. So I'm not sure that they were really sold until after the WPA was dissolved, and then like they were just trying to get rid of it and get it out. Yeah.
My impression is that the WPA didn't care what the imaging was. They just wanted to give people work.
Mm-hmm.
And you had that in the fine arts. You have Krasner, I forget the first name, Pollock's wife,
Yes.
was a WPA artist,
Yeah.
but she wasn't producing anything for WPA.
Mm-hmm.
She was just being paid to be an artist until they decided they had nothing to go on.
But she did, I believe, she did create store designs for, I know the answer to this. She did do work, and it was during the early 1940s, and it was for some kind of radio marketing, or it was for, she did some kind of graphic design work to get people to take something for the war effort, and I'm blanking on it now. So she didn't create art per se, but she was still employed using her artistic skills to do that. But yeah, I mean, there were quite a few artists that are more well known for abstract work, or even later, who were employed by the WPA. Pollock was one of them, Philip Guston, all sorts of people. So, or they benefited from having those art centers. Like I said, Robert Blackburn, Jacob Lawrence, Norman Lewis, all of these artists and more really benefited from these public programs. Did you have a question?
I saw that you had one print early that was printed in 2006, and then there was later on, there was
Yes.
one printed in 60 or something like that.
Yes.
So obviously some plates still exist. And how does that process work as an individual institution?
So those were probably non-WPA. The one that was produced in 2019 was probably the two Woodruff prints, and that was done two portfolios of Hale Woodruff's prints containing 8 prints in each one. They were the same 8 prints. His linoleum blocks were not canceled. And there was a donor or a printmaker, and I'm blanking on their name right now. They worked with Woodruff's widow to create these two portfolios to really get Woodruff's work out there. They really wanted to disseminate it and get it into institutions so that people could learn and use his work. Because Hale Woodruff was an artist who only printed when he needed to print them. He didn't print them in editions, like the WPA. The WPA editions were rather low, around 25 to 35 each, and then they had 5 artist proofs for the artist and a few others. But anyway, so Woodruff, there are still lifetime impressions of those works out. I don't know how many, but the donor and the widow worked together, and they had Robert Blackburn make these portfolios with the intention of making his work more accessible. So the print that we have is a particular, it's done in a precise way with sheen collé, and so you get better detail, and they're just in stellar condition. But they're the same print. And so then after those portfolios were printed, the linoleum blocks were canceled. So you couldn't print from them anymore. And the Schaumburg Research for, anyways, the Schaumburg Research Center has those canceled blocks in addition to a portfolio of those prints. So yeah.
I do have a question. I'm not sure if you know the answer to this or not.
I'll try.
But personally, and I'm not from here, so that's a disclaimer, right?
Sorry.
But in the last section that you showed, why? I guess I'm trying to understand why and what caused the Black people to be treated so poorly. What caused I want to say, the white man to lynch them? What did they do to deserve such horrific treatment?
They didn't do anything. That's the structural racism that is endemic in this country. It has been going on for centuries and centuries. And that was the artist's way of really advocating for those violent events to stop and to hold people accountable. It was really a way of making, of really calling attention to white supremacy as it is, because they have gotten away with so many things. So that would be my answer. I mean, it still happens today. I mean, we still see it today, and I don't know what we can do other. Did you want to say something in the back?
Yeah, about the reference about why. You know, the reference is the fact that violence was a means to extract labor, free labor. You know, and now we're up to 1970. You know, even to this very day, just a while ago, that train thing in Biden, in the strike, that very same thing happened way back in the time. You know, because the United States don't want to pay fair wages. You know, it's just that the deal is, you know, so comes in different ways. But violence is just a means. Really had nothing to do with race, because, you know, that is a phenomenon that just started here in the United States. You know, chattel slavery is new to the United States. It never happened in the rest of the world. But, you know, people here don't believe that slavery was going on for a long time. Yeah, but imagine about that chattel slavery. Chattel slavery started here.
Wrap up.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you.